On the morning of May 3, 1981, 12 coal miners descended into the depths of the Black Mountain Mine in Logan County, West Virginia, and only 3 would see daylight again. By sunset, 9 men lay dead in a flooded tunnel system 800 feet below ground. All experienced miners, all eliminated by a combination of corporate negligence, safety violations, and one foreman's decision that production quotas mattered more than human lives. The West Virginia State Mining Commission would later call it the most preventable industrial disaster in Appalachian history. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't an accident, wasn't natural gas, wasn't even equipment failure. It was a deliberate choice to ignore federal safety regulations, falsified inspection reports, and a company culture that treated miners like disposable equipment. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains details of industrial violence that changed mining safety forever. Logan County, West Virginia, sprawled across 429 square miles of rugged Appalachian terrain in 1981, home to about 47,000 souls scattered between coal camps and company towns that existed solely to extract black gold from the earth. The county seat, also called Logan, held barely 3,000 residents who lived in the shadow of mining operations that had dominated the region since the 1890s. May in West Virginia meant temperatures climbing to the mid-70s during the day, dropping to the low 50s at night when fog rolled down from the ridges like ghostly fingers searching through the valleys. The air carried the perpetual smell of coal dust mixed with diesel exhaust from the constant convoy of trucks hauling loads to processing plants and rail yards. At night, the mountains came alive with the sound of machinery that never stopped, conveyor belts grinding, ventilation fans humming, and the distant rumble of explosives opening new seams deep underground. The darkness was broken by floodlights illuminating mine entrances and the orange glow of processing facilities that operated around the clock. But 1981 was a complex year for coal country. The industry was booming, driven by energy crises and federal policies favoring domestic coal production over foreign oil. Demand had never been higher, prices were climbing, and mining companies were pushing production to unprecedented levels. Every ton extracted meant profit, and profit meant pressure on mine operators to cut corners, speed up operations, and ignore safety protocols that slowed down the money machine. The Reagan administration had taken office promising deregulation across all industries, including mining. Federal inspectors found themselves understaffed and under pressure to work with companies rather than against them. The Mine Safety and Health Administration, created just a decade earlier in response to previous disasters, was already being gutted by budget cuts and political interference. In that environment, companies like Consolidated Coal felt emboldened to push boundaries that had been established in miners' blood. The Black Mountain Mine sat on a ridge overlooking Huff Creek, about 8 miles southeast of Logan proper. The operation extracted coal from multiple seams running through the mountain, with tunnel networks extending over 2 miles underground. On paper, it was a model facility with modern equipment, proper ventilation systems, and all required safety measures. The reality was darker, more dangerous, and ultimately deadly. Robert James Mitchell was 44 years old that May. Though the coal dust embedded in his lungs made him feel closer to 60, he stood 5 feet 10 inches with shoulders broadened by 26 years of underground work, his hands permanently stained black from handling equipment that no amount of scrubbing could clean. A thick scar ran across his left palm from a conveyor belt accident in 1974 that had nearly cost him his fingers. He walked with a slight limp legacy of a roof collapse in 1978 that had pinned him under fallen slate for 3 hours. Every morning, Robert woke at 4:30 in his small frame house on Huff Creek Road, made coffee strong enough to dissolve spoons, and sat on his back porch watching dawn break over the mountains that held both his livelihood and his probable death. He'd smoke 2 cigarettes, unfiltered Camels, and mentally prepare for another day in what miners called the hole. The underground world where sunlight never reached, where the air you breathed was filtered through machines that sometimes failed, where a moment's inattention could crush you under tons of rock or suffocate you in poisonous gas. Robert had started mining at 18, following his father and grandfather into the tunnels because coal was the only industry in Logan County that paid enough to support a family. He'd married young, had 3 children, and spent every day knowing that each trip underground might be his last. But the work paid well, union wages that allowed him to own his home, send his kids to school, and dream of retirement at 55 if his lungs held out that long. What Robert valued most wasn't the money, though God knew his family needed it. What he valued was the brotherhood of miners, men who trusted each other with their lives every single day. Underground, your safety depended on your crew, on following procedures, on looking out for each other because management sure wasn't looking out for you. It was a code of mutual protection that had kept miners alive since the first pickaxe bit into West Virginia coal. In the spring of 1981, that brotherhood was being tested by new management policies that prioritized production over everything else. Consolidated Coal had brought in efficiency experts from corporate headquarters, men in suits who had never set foot underground but had strong opinions about how miners should work faster, cut more coal, and ask fewer questions about safety procedures. Thomas Earl Briggs, everyone called him Tommy, was the day shift foreman at Black Mountain Mine. At 38 years old, he represented a new generation of mine management, college-educated, trained in modern extraction techniques, and under enormous pressure to meet production quotas that seemed to increase every month. Tommy stood 6 feet 2 inches with the pale complexion of a man who spent most of his time in offices rather than tunnels. His hands were soft, unmarked by the scars that covered every experienced miner. Tommy had earned his mining engineering degree from West Virginia University, spent 2 years learning theory and regulations, and then been dropped into the reality of coal extraction where theory met the brutal economics of corporate profit margins. He'd started at Black Mountain 3 years earlier with genuine intentions of running a safe operation, but corporate pressure and quarterly profit demands had gradually worn down his commitment to safety protocols. The miners didn't trust Tommy, and Tommy knew it. To them, he was an outsider, a company man who'd never swung a pickaxe or felt the mountain shift above his head. To corporate management, he was their representative in the field, responsible for delivering coal tonnage regardless of obstacles. Tommy found himself caught between two worlds, trying to balance safety with productivity in an industry where those goals often conflicted. What Tommy didn't understand, what no amount of college education could teach him, was that miners like Robert Mitchell had developed an instinct for danger that kept them alive. 26 years underground teaches you to read the mountain, to hear warnings in the creak of timber supports, to smell gas before instruments detect it, to feel vibrations that signal roof collapse minutes before it happens. That instinct had kept Robert alive through cave-ins, gas leaks, equipment failures, and a dozen near-death experiences. The conflict between old mining wisdom and new corporate efficiency had been building for months. Miners complained about rushed safety inspections, maintenance schedules that prioritized equipment over ventilation systems, and pressure to work in areas that felt dangerous. Tommy dismissed these concerns as resistance to change, fear of modern mining techniques, old-fashioned thinking that slowed progress. The tension came to a head on Friday, May 1st, 1981, 2 days before the disaster that would change everything. Robert and his crew had been assigned to work in Section C of the mine, a relatively new area where extraction had begun just 6 months earlier. The coal seam was rich, potentially very profitable, but the geology was unstable. Previous test drilling had revealed water pockets in the surrounding rock, areas where groundwater had accumulated under pressure. Federal regulations required extensive drainage and monitoring before mining in such areas. The process could take weeks, during which no coal would be extracted and no profit generated. Corporate management had made their position clear. Section C needed to be operational immediately to meet quarterly targets. Safety procedures were obstacles to be minimized, not requirements to be followed. Robert had raised concerns about Section C during the morning safety meeting on May 1st. He'd pointed out unusual water seepage in the tunnels, strange sounds from the rock face that suggested instability, and instrument readings that indicated gas buildup in poorly ventilated areas. Tommy had listened politely, then explained that modern monitoring equipment was more reliable than human intuition, that corporate geologists had certified the area safe, and that production schedules couldn't be delayed for every minor concern. The exchange had been professional, but tense. Robert knew the mountain was trying to tell them something dangerous. Tommy knew that missing production targets would cost him his job. Neither man understood that in 2 days, 9 miners would die because corporate profit had been prioritized over human survival. That Friday afternoon, Section C felt wrong to anyone who'd spent real time underground. The air moved differently, carrying sounds that made experienced miners pause and listen. Water dripped from ceiling joints where it had never dripped before. The rock face showed hairline fractures that seemed to spread between shifts. Instrument panels displayed readings that fluctuated wildly, then returned to normal just long enough to pass inspection. Robert walked the tunnel with his crew, pointing out warning signs that would have shut down any operation run by miners instead of accountants. The ventilation system struggled to clear air that felt thick and strange. Gas monitors beeped intermittently, then fell silent when Tommy arrived for his rounds. The mountain was speaking in the language miners understood, but management had stopped listening. William Henry Garrett, 29 years old, was Robert's closest friend and the most experienced electrician at Black Mountain Mine. Billy had married his high school sweetheart 6 months earlier and was saving money for a house down in town, away from the company housing that kept miners trapped in cycles of debt and dependence. He stood 5 feet 8 inches with the quick reflexes that had kept him alive while working with high-voltage equipment in wet, explosive environments where one mistake could electrocute you or trigger a methane explosion. Billy had grown up in mining camps, learned the trade from his father who died of black lung at 53, and sworn he'd find a way out before the coal dust killed him too. But mining paid 3 times what any other job offered in Logan County, and his new wife wanted children, wanted a future that required money they couldn't earn anywhere else. So Billy worked underground, maintained electrical systems, and counted the days until he could afford to leave. On that Friday afternoon, Billy told Robert that the electrical readings in Section C were unlike anything he'd seen in 8 years of mine work. Power fluctuations suggested water infiltration into junction boxes. Ground fault indicators triggered randomly, then reset themselves. The backup ventilation fans drew amperage that indicated they were working against resistance, possibly blocked airways or compromised ducting. David Michael Santos was the youngest member of Robert's crew at just 22 years old. Fresh out of high school, built like the football player he'd been, with dreams of earning enough money to attend college and study engineering. David represented the 3rd generation of his family to work Black Mountain Mine, following his grandfather and father into tunnels that had provided steady employment for decades. David had been underground for 18 months, long enough to develop respect for the dangers, but not long enough to develop the instincts that kept veterans alive. He trusted the safety equipment, believed in the regulations, and assumed that corporate management wouldn't risk miners' lives for profit margins. That faith in the system would prove tragically misplaced. The crew also included Marcus Ray Thompson, 35, a roof support specialist whose job involved installing and maintaining the timber and steel frameworks that prevented ceiling collapse. Marcus could read rock formations like other men read newspapers, understanding exactly where stress fractures would develop and how much weight the supports could handle before failure. He'd prevented cave-ins that would have killed dozens of miners, working with an intuitive understanding of mountain geology that no textbook could teach. Carl Eugene Williams, 41, operated the continuous mining machine, a massive piece of equipment that carved coal from the face while automatically loading it onto conveyor belts. Carl had been running mining equipment for 15 years, knew every sound the machines made, every vibration that indicated problems. His job required constant attention to multiple systems while working in areas where roof collapse, gas explosion, or equipment malfunction could kill everyone within a 100-yard radius. The final member of the crew was James Patrick O'Brien, 33, a ventilation specialist responsible for maintaining the airflow systems that kept everyone alive underground. Without proper ventilation, miners would suffocate on their own exhaled carbon dioxide within minutes. With inadequate ventilation, methane gas would accumulate to explosive levels. James monitored air quality, adjusted fan speeds, and cleared blockages in ductwork that snaked through miles of tunnel systems. These 6 men formed the core of Robert's crew, experienced professionals who understood their equipment, trusted each other, and had developed the teamwork necessary to survive in one of America's most dangerous work environments. They'd worked together for over 2 years, had saved each other's lives multiple times, and had developed the communication and coordination that kept mining crews functional under extreme stress. But on May 3, 1981, their experience and teamwork wouldn't be enough to overcome corporate decisions made in boardrooms hundreds of miles away by men who'd never breathed coal dust or felt a mountain shift above their heads. The weekend between Robert's warnings and the Monday morning disaster passed with ominous quiet at Black Mountain Mine. Saturday and Sunday shifts reported continuing problems in Section C. Water flow increased, gas readings spiked intermittently, the continuous mining equipment experienced power fluctuations that suggested electrical system compromise. 3 separate miners filed safety reports noting unusual conditions that warranted investigation before normal operations resumed. Tommy Briggs spent Saturday morning reviewing the reports, running calculations, and consulting with corporate engineers by telephone. The engineers hadn't visited the site, hadn't walked the tunnels, hadn't seen the conditions firsthand. They reviewed data sheets, analyzed production schedules, and concluded that minor environmental fluctuations were within acceptable parameters for continued operation. Sunday evening, Tommy received a call from regional management. Production quotas for May were behind schedule. Section C needed to be operational Monday morning. Any delays would require detailed justification to corporate headquarters, potentially impacting the mine's operating license and Tommy's employment status. The message was clear: find ways to continue extraction or find another job. Corporate pressure had transformed a safety decision into an economic calculation. 9 men would die because quarterly profit margins mattered more than mining regulations written in the blood of previous disasters. Monday morning, May 3rd, dawned clear and cold, with temperatures in the upper 40s and fog hanging in the valleys like smoke from some vast underground fire. Robert Mitchell arrived at the mine at 5:30, an hour before his shift started, to review weekend safety reports and check equipment that would be used in Section C. What he found in those reports should have shut down the operation immediately. Water infiltration had increased 300% over the weekend. Methane readings peaked at levels approaching federal evacuation limits. The ventilation system showed signs of partial blockage in airways serving Section C. 3 different monitoring systems had recorded anomalous readings that suggested geological instability in areas where extraction was scheduled to resume. Robert found Tommy in the foreman's office, reviewing production schedules while ignoring the safety reports stacked on his desk. The conversation that followed would be reconstructed later during federal investigations, testimony from miners who overheard the exchange that sealed the fate of 9 men. "Tommy," Robert said, standing in the doorway holding weekend safety reports, "we can't work Section C today. These readings are off the charts. The mountain's trying to tell us something." Tommy looked up from his production schedules, face showing the strain of corporate pressure and sleepless nights spent balancing safety against profits. "Robert, those instruments have been giving false readings for weeks. Corporate engineering says the equipment needs recalibration. We can't shut down every time a monitor acts up." "This isn't equipment malfunction," Robert replied, walking into the office and spreading the reports across Tommy's desk. "Water infiltration, gas buildup, ventilation problems. 3 separate systems all showing the same pattern. Something's happening in that section. Something dangerous." Tommy stood up, walked to the window overlooking the mine entrance where day shift miners were arriving for work. Below them, men were clocking in, collecting equipment, preparing for another day underground. These were his responsibility, but so were the production quotas that kept the mine operational and everyone employed. "Robert," Tommy said without turning around, "corporate says Section C is safe. Engineering says the geology is stable. My job is to extract coal, not shut down operations every time somebody gets nervous." "Your job is to keep miners alive," Robert replied. "Everything else is just rock and profit." The 2 men looked at each other, representing different generations and different philosophies of mine management. Robert, with 26 years of underground experience and an intuitive understanding of mountain dangers. Tommy, with corporate education and pressure to meet targets that seemed to increase every quarter, regardless of safety considerations. At 6:45 that morning, despite every warning sign nature and technology could provide, Tommy Briggs authorized normal operations in Section C of Black Mountain Mine. 9 men would be dead by sunset because corporate profit had been prioritized over miner safety, because warning signs had been ignored, and because the system designed to protect underground workers had been corrupted by economic pressure. The shift began like any other, with safety briefings that covered routine hazards while ignoring the catastrophic danger building in Section C. Equipment was distributed, assignments given, and crews dispatched to areas where extraction would continue despite mounting evidence that the mountain was preparing to reclaim the coal that had been stolen from its depths. At 7:15 a.m., Robert Mitchell led his crew toward Section C, carrying equipment and supplies for what was supposed to be a normal day of coal extraction. None of them knew they were walking toward the worst mining disaster in Logan County history, toward a flooded tunnel system that would become their tomb, toward a preventable tragedy that would change mining safety regulations forever. Forever. At 7:15 a.m., Robert Mitchell descended into Black Mountain Mine for the last time, leading his crew through the main shaft elevator that dropped 800 feet into the earth with mechanical precision. The cage rattled and swayed as it carried 6 men toward their assignments in Section C, the air growing colder and thicker with each foot of descent. Emergency lighting cast long shadows on the shaft walls, illuminating layers of rock that had been undisturbed for millions of years until human ambition and corporate greed had decided to tear them apart. The elevator stopped with a metallic clang that echoed through the tunnel system. Robert stepped out first, followed by Billy Garrett, David Santos, Marcus Thompson, Carl Williams, and James O'Brien. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd worked together long enough to communicate without words, collecting mining equipment from storage areas and checking safety gear one final time before heading toward the active extraction zone. The main tunnel stretched ahead of them, lit by strings of bulbs that disappeared into darkness beyond their range. The air smelled of diesel exhaust from underground vehicles, coal dust that hung perpetually in the atmosphere, and something else, something that made Robert pause and breathe deeply. Water. More water than should be present in properly maintained mining areas. The smell carried traces of minerals and organic matter that suggested the water had been moving through rock formations for a long time, building pressure, seeking release. Behind them, other crews dispersed to different sections of the mine. The morning shift included 42 miners total, working areas throughout the underground complex. Sections A and B were operating normally, extracting coal from seams that had been worked for over a year without major incidents. Section D was undergoing routine maintenance, ventilation upgrades that would improve airflow and safety margins. Only Section C represented unknown danger, geological instability that had been noted but ignored. As they walked deeper into the mountain, Robert's crew passed monitoring stations where instruments measured air quality, gas concentrations, and structural stability. The readings displayed on digital panels should have triggered immediate evacuation protocols. Methane levels fluctuated between acceptable and dangerous. Water detection sensors registered moisture content that exceeded normal parameters. Seismic monitoring equipment recorded micro-tremors that suggested ongoing geological movement. But the instruments had been displaying similar readings for weeks, and corporate engineering had classified them as equipment malfunction rather than legitimate warnings. The sensors were scheduled for recalibration, a process that would take months to complete and cost money that reduced quarterly profits. In the meantime, extraction would continue under the assumption that modern mining technology was more reliable than human instinct developed over generations of underground work. Billy Garrett noticed it first, the change in air pressure that experienced miners recognize as a harbinger of disaster. The atmosphere felt thick, heavy, like breathing through wet cloth. Ventilation fans labored against resistance that shouldn't exist in properly maintained airways. The sound of moving air, usually constant and reassuring, carried strange harmonics that suggested blockages or structural damage in the ductwork system. David Santos, walking beside Billy, felt sweat on his palms despite the cool underground temperature. At 22, he lacked the experience to interpret the warning signs his body was receiving, but some primitive survival instinct made him nervous. The tunnel felt different this morning, more confined, more threatening. He found himself looking up frequently, checking the roof supports that Marcus Thompson had installed and maintained according to federal specifications. Marcus himself was studying those supports with growing concern. The timber and steel frameworks showed stress patterns that hadn't been present Friday afternoon. New cracks appeared in wooden beams. Metal joints displayed microscopic movement that indicated shifting weight loads. The mountain was adjusting its position, settling in ways that created pressure on artificial supports designed to hold back millions of tons of rock and earth. Carl Williams operated the continuous mining machine with mechanical precision, but his attention was divided between equipment operation and environmental conditions that felt increasingly unstable. The machine carved coal from the face while sensors monitored cutting efficiency, power consumption, and operational safety margins. What the sensors couldn't measure was the subtle change in rock density. the way the coal face responded differently to cutting blades, the vibrations that suggested geological instability beyond the immediate work area. James O'Brien monitored ventilation systems with growing alarm. Airflow readings indicated partial blockage in primary airways. Secondary ventilation circuits showed pressure differentials that suggested structural damage or debris accumulation. The backup systems were functioning, but operating at capacity levels that left no margin for additional problems. If the primary ventilation failed completely, the backup systems would be inadequate to maintain safe air quality for 42 miners working throughout the underground complex. At 8:30 a.m., exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes before the disaster that would kill 9 men, Robert's crew reached the entrance to Section C. The area looked normal to casual observation, properly lit and equipped according to federal mining regulations. But experienced miners noticed details that revealed the true danger lurking behind corporate assurances and engineering calculations. Water stains marked the walls where moisture had seeped through rock joints. The stains were fresh, still wet, indicating active infiltration that was increasing rather than stabilizing. Puddles had formed in low areas of the tunnel floor, clear evidence that groundwater was finding new pathways through geological formations that were supposed to be stable and dry. The continuous mining equipment sat positioned against the coal face, ready to resume extraction that had been suspended over the weekend for safety evaluations. Those evaluations had been conducted by corporate engineers who relied on instrument readings rather than physical inspection, men who'd never worked underground and didn't understand the difference between theoretical safety and practical survival. Marcus Thompson examined the roof supports installed in Section C, timber and steel frameworks that were designed to prevent ceiling collapse during coal extraction. The supports showed signs of stress that hadn't been present during their installation 6 months earlier. Wooden beams displayed hairline cracks that indicated ongoing pressure. Steel joints had shifted slightly, microscopic movements that suggested the mountain was adjusting to accommodate forces that exceeded engineering calculations. "This doesn't look right," Marcus said quietly, running his hands along a support beam that showed fresh stress marks. "These timbers are moving. The whole framework's under pressure it wasn't designed to handle." Robert nodded, studying the ceiling where rock formations displayed patterns that suggested instability. The coal seam they'd been extracting was rich and profitable, but it existed in a geological context that included water-bearing rock layers above and below the extraction zone. Removing coal created empty spaces that allowed those layers to shift, potentially opening pathways for groundwater that had been contained for millions of years. Billy Garrett checked electrical systems that powered lighting, ventilation, and mining equipment throughout Section C. The circuits showed signs of moisture infiltration that could trigger power failures or create explosion hazards if methane gas accumulated to dangerous levels. Ground fault indicators suggested water was reaching junction boxes and cable runs that were supposed to remain dry throughout the mining operation. "We've got water in the electrical systems," Billy reported, studying readings that indicated compromised insulation and potential short-circuit conditions. "These circuits weren't designed to operate in wet environments. We're looking at power failures, maybe explosion hazards if gas levels spike." David Santos operated monitoring equipment that measured air quality, gas concentrations, and environmental conditions throughout the work area. The instruments displayed readings that fluctuated wildly, then returned to normal ranges just long enough to suggest equipment malfunction rather than genuine environmental hazards. Methane levels peaked at concentrations approaching federal evacuation limits, then dropped to acceptable ranges within minutes. "These readings don't make sense," David said, studying displays that seemed to contradict each other. "Gas concentrations are spiking, then falling, then spiking again. Either the equipment's broken or something's happening that we don't understand." Carl Williams positioned the continuous mining machine for resumed coal extraction, checking cutting blades, conveyor systems, and hydraulic controls that would carve tons of coal from the face during the shift. The machine represented millions of dollars of equipment, sophisticated technology designed to extract maximum coal with minimum labor costs. What it couldn't account for were geological conditions that existed beyond the immediate cutting area. James O'Brien studied ventilation readings that indicated airflow problems throughout Section C. The primary ventilation system was operating, but air movement patterns suggested blockages or restrictions that impeded proper circulation. Without adequate ventilation, methane gas would accumulate to explosive levels within hours. Carbon dioxide would build to concentrations that could suffocate miners before they realized the danger. At 9 a.m., 30 minutes before the water breakthrough that would flood Section C and kill 9 miners, Robert Mitchell made the decision that sealed the fate of his crew. Despite every warning sign nature and technology could provide, despite 26 years of underground experience that screamed danger, despite instrument readings that indicated catastrophic hazards, he authorized his crew to begin coal extraction in an area that should have been evacuated immediately. The decision wasn't made from ignorance or recklessness. Robert understood the dangers better than anyone, but he also understood the economic pressures that kept Black Mountain Mine operational. The corporate demands that prioritized production over safety, the reality that shutting down Section C would cost him his job and leave his family without income in a county where coal mining was the only industry that paid living wages. Corporate management had made their position clear through Tommy Briggs and regional supervisors. Section C would operate normally regardless of minor environmental fluctuations. Any delays would require detailed justification that could impact mine licensing and employment security. The choice was extract coal or find other work in an economy that offered no alternatives for men whose only skills involved underground mining. So Robert made the choice that thousands of miners make every day in coal country, the choice between safety and survival, between protecting their crews and supporting their families. He authorized coal extraction in Section C because corporate pressure had made that authorization inevitable, because the system designed to protect miners had been corrupted by profit margins and quarterly targets. The continuous mining machine roared to life at 9:15 a.m., cutting blades spinning at high speed as they bit into the coal face and carved away tons of material that had been compressed under geological pressure for millions of years. The machine operated with mechanical precision, following cutting patterns designed to maximize extraction while maintaining structural stability in surrounding rock formations. But structural stability was a theoretical concept that assumed geological conditions matched engineering calculations. The reality in Section C was that water-bearing rock layers above the coal seam had been destabilized by months of extraction, creating pressure differentials that exceeded the safety margins built into mining plans. Every ton of coal removed increased the likelihood of catastrophic failure. Marcus Thompson monitored roof supports as the mining machine advanced, watching for signs of increased stress or structural movement that would indicate ceiling instability. The timber and steel frameworks creaked and shifted under loads that seemed to increase with each passing minute. New cracks appeared in wooden beams. Metal joints displayed movement that suggested the supports were approaching their design limits. Billy Garrett maintained electrical systems that powered all equipment in Section C, monitoring circuits that showed increasing signs of moisture infiltration. Water was reaching electrical components that were designed to remain dry, creating conditions that could trigger power failures or explosion hazards. The electrical systems were the lifeline that powered ventilation, lighting, and communication equipment essential for miner survival. David Santos operated monitoring instruments that displayed increasingly erratic readings as environmental conditions deteriorated beyond the range of normal mining operations. Methane gas concentrations spiked to dangerous levels, then fell to acceptable ranges, then spiked again in patterns that suggested geological instability. Air pressure fluctuated in ways that indicated structural movement in surrounding rock formations. Carl Williams guided the continuous mining machine as it advanced deeper into the coal seam, carving away material that had supported overlying rock layers for geological ages. Each cut destabilized the area further, creating empty spaces that allowed water-bearing formations to shift and settle. The machine operated flawlessly, extracting coal with efficiency that impressed corporate accountants and terrified experienced miners. James O'Brien monitored ventilation systems that struggled to maintain air quality in an environment where geological conditions were changing faster than equipment could adapt. Primary ventilation circuits showed signs of blockage or restriction. Secondary systems operated at maximum capacity with no safety margins remaining. If anything went wrong with air circulation, 42 miners would face suffocation or explosion hazards within minutes. At 9:45 a.m., exactly 15 minutes before water breakthrough would flood Section C and kill 9 miners, the continuous mining machine cut through the final barrier that separated the coal seam from a water-bearing rock formation that contained millions of gallons of groundwater under geological pressure that had been building for millennia. The machine operator felt the change immediately. a sudden reduction in cutting resistance that indicated the blades had encountered something other than coal or rock. The cutting pattern changed, vibrations increased. Power consumption fluctuated as the machine struggled to process material that didn't match the specifications programmed into its control systems. Then came the sound that every experienced miner fears above all others, the deep rumble that indicates geological movement on a massive scale. Not the sharp crack of falling rock or the mechanical failure of equipment, but the sustained thunder of millions of tons of earth and stone shifting position as water pressure overcame the barriers that had contained it since before human civilization existed. Robert Mitchell heard that sound and understood immediately what was happening, what was about to happen, what corporate negligence and safety violations had made inevitable. Water breakthrough, catastrophic flooding, the worst nightmare of underground mining, transformed from theoretical possibility to deadly reality by decisions made in corporate boardrooms by men who'd never breathed coal dust or felt a mountain shift above their heads. At 9:47 a.m., the first trickle of water emerged from the coal face where the continuous mining machine had broken through into the water-bearing formation. Carl Williams saw it immediately, a thin stream that caught the light from his helmet lamp as it ran down the freshly cut rock. The water looked harmless, almost insignificant, like moisture from a leaking pipe rather than the harbinger of catastrophic flooding that would kill 9 men within the next 13 minutes. Carl shut down the mining machine instantly, following procedures that had been drilled into him through 15 years of underground work. When you see unexpected water, you stop everything, you back away, you report to supervision, you evacuate if necessary. But the procedures assumed that supervision would respond appropriately, that safety protocols would override production pressures, that human life would matter more than corporate profit margins. The water flow increased as Carl watched, changing from a trickle to a steady stream within seconds. The pressure behind that water had been building for geological ages, contained by rock barriers that mining operations had systematically weakened. Now that the barrier was breached, physics and gravity would determine what happened next. Millions of gallons of groundwater would seek the lowest available space, which happened to be the tunnel system where 42 miners were working 800 feet below ground. "Robert," Carl called over the communication system, voice tight with controlled panic. "We've got water breakthrough in Section C. Shutting down equipment now. We need immediate evacuation." Robert Mitchell heard those words and felt his stomach drop into his boots. Water breakthrough was the nightmare scenario that had killed more coal miners than cave-ins, gas explosions, and equipment accidents combined. Once water found its way into underground workings, it followed tunnel systems like a liquid avalanche, flooding areas miles away from the original breach. Miners could be trapped in dead-end passages, cut off from escape routes by rapidly rising water levels. "How much water?" Robert asked, already moving toward Section C while mentally calculating evacuation routes and emergency procedures. His 26 years of experience kicked in automatically, assessing threats and planning responses even as fear threatened to overwhelm rational thought. "It's increasing fast," Carl replied, backing away from the coal face where water flow had tripled in the past 30 seconds. "This isn't seepage, Robert. This is a major breach. We need to get everyone out now." Robert keyed his radio to contact Tommy Briggs in the surface office, knowing that mine-wide evacuation required foreman authorization and coordination with emergency response teams. The conversation that followed would be reconstructed later during federal investigations, radio transmissions recorded automatically by safety monitoring systems that documented every word spoken as 9 men died. "Tommy, this is Robert in Section C. We have water breakthrough, major flow. Request immediate mine evacuation." The radio crackled with static for several seconds before Tommy's voice responded, strained and uncertain. "How major, Robert? Can you contain it with pumping equipment?" "Negative. This is geological failure, not equipment malfunction. We need evacuation now." Another pause, longer this time, while Tommy Briggs wrestled with a decision that would determine whether 9 miners lived or died. Corporate management had made their expectations clear. Production delays required detailed justification. Mine shutdowns cost thousands of dollars per hour. Emergency evacuations triggered federal investigations that could result in operational suspensions and financial penalties. "Robert," Tommy finally replied, "monitor the situation and report back in 10 minutes. We're checking with corporate engineering about pumping options." 10 minutes. Robert thought. Watching water flow from Section C increase to levels that already made normal evacuation impossible. In 10 minutes, the tunnel system would be partially flooded. In 10 minutes, escape routes would be cut off. In 10 minutes, 9 miners would be dead because corporate management had prioritized profit margins over human survival. But Robert Mitchell had spent 26 years learning to survive in environments where corporate management decisions often conflicted with miner safety. He understood that sometimes you had to choose between following orders and saving lives. He keyed his radio to the mine-wide frequency, bypassing Tommy Briggs and speaking directly to every crew working underground. All crews, this is Robert Mitchell. Water breakthrough in Section C, major flooding imminent. Begin immediate evacuation. This is not a drill. The response was immediate and chaotic. 42 miners scattered throughout the underground complex began moving toward escape routes while trying to understand the scope of the emergency. Some crews were close to elevator shafts and could reach surface safety within minutes. Others were deep in tunnel systems that might already be cut off by rising water levels. Billy Garrett, working electrical systems near the Section C entrance, saw the water advancing with mechanical inevitability. The flow had increased from a stream to a torrent, carrying coal dust and debris as it filled the tunnel floor and began rising toward equipment installations. Within minutes, the water would reach electrical junction boxes, triggering power failures that would plunge sections of the mine into darkness. "We're losing power," Billy reported over his radio, working frantically to shut down electrical circuits before water could cause short circuits or electrocution hazards. "The main distribution panel is flooding. We'll have emergency lighting only in about 3 minutes." David Santos operated monitoring equipment that displayed readings unlike anything in his 18 months of underground experience. Gas concentrations spiked as water displacement forced methane from rock crevices into the air circulation system. Air pressure fluctuated wildly as ventilation systems struggled to accommodate water that was blocking airways and changing tunnel configurations. The instruments measured environmental conditions that exceeded the safety parameters programmed into their monitoring systems. Marcus Thompson studied roof supports that were responding to water pressure with stress patterns that indicated imminent structural failure. The timber and steel frameworks had been designed to support coal extraction, not resist hydraulic pressure from millions of gallons of groundwater. As water levels rose, hydrostatic pressure would increase exponentially, crushing support structures and triggering ceiling collapses that would trap miners beneath tons of fallen rock. "The supports are failing," Marcus reported, watching wooden beams crack under pressure loads that exceeded their engineering specifications. "Water pressure's going to bring down the whole ceiling. We need to get out now." James O'Brien monitored ventilation systems that were shutting down automatically as water reached fan installations and electrical controls. Primary ventilation circuits failed as water flooded equipment rooms. Secondary systems operated briefly before succumbing to the same hydraulic assault. Without mechanical ventilation, methane gas would accumulate to explosive levels within minutes, while carbon dioxide buildup threatened to suffocate anyone trapped in dead-end passages. "Ventilation failure," James reported, his voice tight with panic as he watched air circulation systems collapse one by one. "We're losing life support. Gas levels are spiking. Anyone still underground needs to reach surface immediately." Carl Williams abandoned the continuous mining machine and began moving toward escape routes, but water flow had already cut off the most direct path to elevator shafts. The tunnel system that had seemed spacious and well-planned during normal operations became a death trap as rising water blocked passages and forced miners into increasingly confined spaces. The machine he'd operated for years would remain underground, a $1 million monument to corporate decisions that prioritized equipment over human life. At 9:52 a.m., 5 minutes after water breakthrough, Section C was completely flooded to ceiling level. The torrent continued pouring through the breached barrier, seeking lower elevations throughout the tunnel system. Water followed gravitational flow patterns, filling dead-end passages and creating hydraulic pressure that compressed air into pockets where trapped miners struggled to breathe. Robert Mitchell found himself cut off from escape routes by water that had risen to chest level and was still climbing. The tunnel system he'd navigated for 26 years had transformed into an underground river system where familiar landmarks disappeared beneath black water that carried the smell of ancient rock and organic decay. Emergency lighting flickered and failed as electrical systems succumbed to flooding, leaving miners dependent on battery-powered helmet lamps that would last perhaps 2 hours. Around him, 5 other miners faced the same deadly situation. Billy Garrett, David Santos, Marcus Thompson, Carl Williams, and James O'Brien, experienced professionals who understood their equipment and trusted each other but couldn't overcome the hydraulic forces unleashed by corporate negligence and safety violations. The water continued rising, driven by pressure that had accumulated over geological time periods. What had taken millions of years to contain was released in minutes, transforming profitable coal extraction into a death trap that would claim 9 lives before emergency response teams could even reach the mine entrance. Tommy Briggs, monitoring the situation from his surface office, finally authorized mine-wide evacuation at 9:54 a.m., 7 minutes after Robert Mitchell had requested immediate emergency response. The delay cost precious time that might have saved lives, minutes during which rising water cut off escape routes and trapped miners in areas that became underwater tombs. Emergency response teams arrived at Black Mountain Mine at 10:15 a.m., finding surface facilities in chaos as surviving miners emerged from underground workings with reports of catastrophic flooding. 33 miners reached safety through elevator shafts and emergency exits that remained above water level. 9 miners remained trapped in Section C and connecting tunnels, caught in a hydraulic nightmare that made rescue impossible. The West Virginia State Mining Commission dispatched investigators immediately, but their work would focus on determining what had happened rather than preventing it. Federal mine safety inspectors arrived within hours, but their authority extended only to documenting violations that had already killed 9 men. Corporate executives flew in from headquarters, but their concerns centered on liability management rather than miner welfare. By noon on May 3, 1981, Black Mountain Mine had become the site of the worst coal mining disaster in Logan County history. 9 experienced miners were dead, killed by water that had been contained safely until corporate pressure forced extraction in areas that should have remained untouched. The disaster would trigger federal investigations, safety regulation changes, and congressional hearings that exposed the systematic corruption of mining safety by profit-driven decision-making. But those investigations couldn't bring back Robert Mitchell, Billy Garrett, David Santos, Marcus Thompson, Carl Williams, James O'Brien, or the 3 other miners whose names would be added to the long list of coal mining casualties. They died because warning signs were ignored, because safety reports were dismissed, because corporate management believed that production quotas mattered more than human lives. The water that killed them continued flowing through Black Mountain Mine for weeks, pumped out by equipment that cost more than the combined lifetime earnings of the 9 dead miners. When the tunnels were finally drained and investigators could examine the disaster site, they found evidence of safety violations that should have shut down the operation months earlier. Falsified inspection reports documented safety conditions that didn't exist. Maintenance schedules showed equipment repairs that were never performed. Corporate communications revealed management decisions that prioritized profit margins over federal mining regulations designed to protect underground workers. The investigation would reveal a pattern of corporate negligence that extended far beyond Black Mountain Mine, systematic safety violations that endangered thousands of miners throughout Appalachian coal country. But for the families of 9 dead miners, those revelations provided no comfort, no justice, no compensation for lives lost to corporate greed disguised as operational efficiency. Martha Mitchell, Robert's widow, would spend the rest of her life fighting for mining safety reforms that might prevent similar disasters. Billy Garrett's young wife would raise their children alone, sustained by union benefits and community support, but haunted by questions about what might have been prevented. David Santos's parents would bury their son's dreams of college education and engineering career, watching their youngest child disappear into the ground that had provided their living for 3 generations. The 9 miners who died at Black Mountain Mine on May 3, 1981, became statistics in federal safety databases, their names recorded in congressional testimony and regulatory documents that gathered dust in Washington offices. But in Logan County, they remained husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers whose absence left holes in families and community that would never heal completely. The disaster also marked a turning point in coal mining safety, demonstrating the deadly consequences of corporate deregulation and profit-driven decision-making. Federal investigators would use evidence from Black Mountain Mine to strengthen safety regulations, increase enforcement authority, and establish criminal penalties for mine operators who knowingly endangered workers. But those improvements came too late for 9 miners who died because corporate management had decided that water breakthrough was an acceptable risk compared to production delays. They died because falsified safety reports had hidden geological hazards that should have triggered immediate evacuation. They died because the system designed to protect underground workers had been corrupted by economic pressures that treated human life as an operational expense rather than an irreplaceable value. The Black Mountain Mine disaster would become a case study in industrial negligence, cited in safety training programs and regulatory proceedings for decades afterward. But the real lesson wasn't technical or procedural. The real lesson was moral, about what happens when corporate profit margins matter more than human survival, when safety regulations become obstacles to be circumvented rather than requirements to be followed. 9 men died underground on May 3, 1981, drowned in water that could have been contained if corporate management had prioritized miner safety over quarterly earnings. Their deaths exposed a system of corruption and negligence that endangered thousands of coal miners throughout Appalachian regions where coal extraction provided the economic foundation for entire communities. The families of those 9 miners would carry their grief forever, sustained by memories of men who'd worked dangerous jobs to support their families and communities. But they would also carry determination to ensure that similar disasters never happened again, that future miners wouldn't die because corporate executives valued profit margins more than human lives. The rescue attempt began at 2:30 p.m., 4.5 hours after water breakthrough had flooded Section C and trapped 9 miners in underwater tunnels. Emergency response teams from across West Virginia converged on Black Mountain Mine, bringing specialized equipment designed for underground water rescue operations that rarely succeeded but had to be attempted regardless of odds. Captain Dale Richardson of the West Virginia State Mine Rescue Team was 48 years old, with 25 years of experience in underground emergency operations. He'd participated in dozens of rescue attempts, had pulled living miners from collapsed tunnels and gas-filled chambers, but had never faced hydraulic conditions like those at Black Mountain Mine. The water flow was unprecedented, driven by geological pressure that had overwhelmed every containment system. Richardson assembled his team in the mine office, studying diagrams of the tunnel system while calculating rescue possibilities that seemed to diminish with each passing hour. The flooded areas included Section C and all connecting passages, roughly 2 miles of underground workings now submerged beneath water that continued rising despite massive pumping operations. 9 miners were trapped somewhere in that flooded maze, either dead already or clinging to air pockets that would disappear as water levels continued climbing. The primary rescue shaft remained operational, providing access to tunnel levels above the flood zone, but reaching Section C required passage through flooded areas where water depth exceeded 20 feet and strong currents made navigation impossible even for experienced divers. The tunnel system had been designed for coal extraction, not underwater rescue operations, with narrow passages and debris obstacles that could trap rescue personnel as easily as the miners they were trying to reach. Dr. Margaret Holloway, a mining engineer from West Virginia University, analyzed geological data that revealed the scope of water infiltration into Black Mountain Mine. The breached formation contained an estimated 50 million gallons of groundwater under pressure that had been building for millennia. Even with industrial pumping equipment operating at maximum capacity, water levels would continue rising for days, or potentially weeks, before reaching equilibrium. "This isn't a rescue situation anymore, Doctor," Holloway told Captain Richardson during a briefing that began with hope and ended with grim reality. "The hydraulic forces involved exceed anything our equipment can handle. Those tunnels are completely submerged, with water pressure that would crush anyone attempting to reach the trapped areas." Richardson understood the technical assessment but couldn't accept abandoning 9 miners without attempting every possible rescue option. His team had successfully extracted living miners from situations that seemed hopeless, working in environments where minutes meant the difference between survival and death. Professional obligation and personal conscience demanded that they try, regardless of odds or expert predictions about geological impossibility. The first rescue team descended at 3:15 p.m., using specialized diving equipment designed for underwater tunnel operations. The team included Richardson, 2 experienced mine rescue divers, and a safety coordinator who would monitor conditions from above the floodline. They carried emergency air supplies, underwater communication equipment, and cutting tools that might be needed to clear debris blocking access to trapped areas. The descent into flooded tunnels revealed conditions that exceeded their worst expectations. Water clarity was essentially zero, reduced to black liquid that absorbed helmet lamp illumination within inches. Strong currents created by continuing water flow made navigation extremely difficult, requiring constant effort to maintain position and direction. The tunnel walls, familiar landmarks during normal operations, became invisible reference points that could only be located by touch. Debris filled the water column, coal dust and equipment fragments that had been swept along by the torrent during initial flooding. Loose electrical cables created entanglement hazards for divers wearing bulky equipment in confined spaces. Timber roof supports, weakened by water pressure, threatened to collapse and trap rescue personnel beneath tons of fallen wood and rock. After 40 minutes of underwater exploration, the rescue team reached the entrance to Section C, where water flow from the breached formation had created current velocities that made further progress impossible. The diving equipment, designed for relatively calm water operations, couldn't provide adequate propulsion against hydraulic forces that threatened to sweep rescuers into dead-end passages where they would become additional casualties. Captain Richardson made the decision that haunted him for the rest of his career. At 4 p.m., he ordered the rescue team to surface, acknowledging that underwater conditions made further rescue attempts too dangerous for his personnel. 9 miners remained trapped in flooded tunnels, but attempting to reach them would only add more names to the casualty list without improving their survival chances. The decision was professionally sound, but emotionally devastating. Richardson had spent 25 years saving miners from underground disasters, building a reputation for successful rescues under impossible conditions. Black Mountain Mine represented his first complete failure, a situation where technological limitations and geological forces made rescue impossible, despite the presence of potentially living miners just hundreds of feet away. Tommy Briggs watched the failed rescue attempt from surface facilities, understanding finally that his authorization of coal extraction in Section C had killed 9 men and ended his own career in mine management. Federal investigators were already examining his decisions, reviewing safety reports he'd ignored, and documenting corporate pressure that had influenced his judgment during critical moments when miner safety should have been the only consideration. The corporate executives who'd demanded continued production despite safety warnings were notably absent from the mine site during rescue operations. Regional managers cited scheduling conflicts that prevented their attendance. Corporate safety directors claimed they were coordinating response efforts from headquarters offices. Vice presidents responsible for operational decisions were unavailable for comment, protected by legal counsel who advised against public statements that might impact liability proceedings. Martha Mitchell arrived at Black Mountain Mine at 4:30 p.m., 4 hours after learning that her husband was trapped underground in flooded tunnels where rescue was impossible. She was 42 years old, had been married to Robert for 18 years, and had spent every day of their marriage knowing that coal mining might make her a widow, but knowing the danger theoretically was different from facing the reality that her husband was dead because corporate management had valued profit margins more than human life. She joined other families gathering at the mine office, wives and children who'd received phone calls telling them that fathers and husbands weren't coming home. The families formed a grief-stricken community, united by loss and anger, supporting each other while demanding answers from mine management about how preventable safety violations had been allowed to kill their loved ones. Billy Garrett's wife Sarah arrived with their 6-month-old daughter, too young to understand why Daddy wouldn't be coming home from work anymore. Sarah was 24 years old, had married Billy right out of high school, and faced the prospect of raising their child alone on whatever benefits the mine company and union would provide. Her husband had died trying to maintain electrical systems that kept other miners alive, working until the last possible moment before water made evacuation impossible. David Santos's parents drove from their home near Logan, arriving to learn that their youngest son was dead at 22 years old. His dreams of college education and engineering career ended in flooded tunnels that had become his tomb. David had been their hope for breaking the family cycle of underground mining, the first generation that might escape coal dust and develop skills that didn't require risking death for weekly wages. The families demanded access to mine officials, corporate executives, and federal investigators who could explain how warning signs had been ignored, safety reports falsified, and production quotas prioritized over human survival. Their grief transformed rapidly into anger as they learned about the systematic violations that had made the disaster inevitable, the corporate decisions that had treated their husbands and fathers as expendable resources. Federal investigators arrived throughout the afternoon. Representatives from the Mine Safety and Health Administration, the Department of Labor, and congressional committees responsible for mining oversight. They brought legal authority to compel testimony, subpoena corporate documents, and impose penalties for safety violations that had contributed to the disaster. But they couldn't bring back 9 dead miners or restore families that had been destroyed by corporate negligence. Dr. James Patterson, a federal mining safety inspector with 30 years of experience, examined Black Mountain mine records and found evidence of violations that should have resulted in immediate operational suspension. Safety reports had been falsified to hide geological hazards. Maintenance schedules showed equipment repairs that were never performed. Corporate communications revealed systematic pressure to ignore federal regulations that interfered with production targets. "This is criminal negligence," Dr. Patterson told investigators during an evening briefing that outlined the scope of safety violations discovered at Black Mountain Mine. "We have documented evidence of falsified safety reports, ignored geological warnings, and corporate policies that prioritized profit over compliance with federal mining regulations designed to protect underground workers." The investigation expanded rapidly as federal authorities recognized that Black Mountain Mine represented a pattern of safety violations that extended throughout Appalachian coal country. Other mining operations owned by Consolidated Coal showed similar evidence of falsified reports, ignored warnings, and corporate pressure to maintain production despite safety hazards that endangered thousands of miners. Congressional hearings were scheduled to examine the regulatory failures that had allowed systematic safety violations to continue without federal intervention. The hearings would reveal that budget cuts and political pressure had reduced mine safety enforcement to a level that made corporate compliance voluntary rather than mandatory, allowing companies to treat safety regulations as suggestions rather than legal requirements. But congressional investigations and federal penalties provided no comfort to families whose loved ones had died in Black Mountain Mine. Martha Mitchell would spend the rest of her life fighting for mining safety reforms, testifying before congressional committees and supporting legislation that might prevent similar disasters. Her husband's death had taught her that corporate power could override federal regulations unless public pressure demanded enforcement of laws written in miners' blood. The mine itself remained flooded for 6 weeks, until specialized pumping equipment could remove millions of gallons of water that had transformed profitable coal extraction into an underground lake system. When investigators finally reached Section C, they found the bodies of 9 miners who had died trying to escape hydraulic forces unleashed by corporate greed and management negligence. Robert Mitchell was found near the Section C entrance, apparently attempting to coordinate evacuation procedures until rising water made escape impossible. His body position suggested he'd remained at his post, ensuring that other miners had opportunities to reach safety before concerning himself with personal survival. 26 years of underground experience had taught him that crew leaders protected their men, even when protection meant personal sacrifice. Billy Garrett was discovered near electrical junction boxes he'd been trying to shut down before water caused electrocution hazards for other miners. His final actions had prevented additional deaths, ensuring that rescue teams wouldn't face electrical dangers during their attempts to reach trapped personnel. He'd died protecting colleagues he'd worked with for years, men who trusted his expertise with underground electrical systems. David Santos, Marcus Thompson, Carl Williams, and James O'Brien were found together in a dead-end passage where they'd apparently sought higher ground as water levels rose throughout the tunnel system. Their positions suggested they'd worked together until the end, sharing air and resources while hoping for rescue that never came. The youngest and oldest members of the crew had faced death with the brotherhood that sustained coal miners through decades of dangerous underground work. The remaining 2 miners were discovered in separate locations, apparently swept away by currents during initial flooding when water breakthrough created hydraulic conditions that made orderly evacuation impossible. Their bodies showed evidence of attempts to reach escape routes that had been cut off by rising water levels, efforts that failed because corporate management had delayed evacuation authorization until hydraulic forces made survival impossible. Recovery operations took 3 days, using specialized equipment to remove bodies from flooded tunnels while preserving evidence needed for federal investigations and potential criminal proceedings. Each recovery was witnessed by family members who needed to see that their loved ones were treated with dignity and respect, that corporate negligence wouldn't extend to desecration of the men who died because safety warnings had been ignored. The funerals drew thousands of mourners from throughout Logan County and surrounding areas, coal mining communities that understood the dangers faced by underground workers and the corporate pressures that made those dangers increasingly deadly. 9 separate services celebrated lives that had ended too soon because profit margins mattered more than human survival in boardrooms hundreds of miles from the coalface. Robert Mitchell was buried in the hillside cemetery overlooking Huff Creek, where 3 generations of his family lay in graves marked by simple stones that recorded names and dates without explaining how good men had died in preventable industrial disasters. His funeral drew over 800 mourners, including miners from throughout West Virginia, who understood that Robert's death represented their own vulnerability to corporate decisions that treated worker safety as an operational expense. The investigation continued for months, revealing the full scope of safety violations and corporate negligence that had made the Black Mountain Mine disaster inevitable. Federal prosecutors examined evidence for potential criminal charges against mine management and corporate executives whose decisions had directly contributed to 9 deaths through systematic violation of safety regulations. Consolidated Coal faced federal penalties totaling $2.3 million, the largest fine in mining industry history at that time. But the company's annual profits exceeded $400 million, making the penalties a minor cost of doing business rather than meaningful deterrent to future safety violations. Corporate executives received administrative sanctions that didn't include prison time or personal financial penalties for decisions that had killed 9 miners. The Black Mountain Mine disaster stands as a testament to what happens when corporate greed overrides human decency, when quarterly profits matter more than the men who risk their lives to extract them. 9 miners died on May 3, 1981, not from accident or act of God, but from deliberate choices made in boardrooms by executives who'd never breathed coal dust or felt a mountain shift above their heads. Their deaths exposed a system of corruption that treated safety regulations as suggestions and human lives as acceptable losses in the pursuit of operational efficiency. If this story of industrial murder disguised as workplace accident has shown you anything, it should be this. The monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're created in corporate meetings where profit margins eclipse moral responsibility, where warning signs become obstacles to quarterly targets, where 9 good men become statistics in federal databases. The line between legitimate business and criminal negligence disappeared that May morning when water broke through barriers that should have protected those tunnels, when rescue became impossible because evacuation had been delayed for corporate convenience. Remember their names: Robert Mitchell, Billy Garrett, David Santos, Marcus Thompson, Carl Williams, James O'Brien, and the others whose families still carry grief that never fully heals. They died so we could understand the true cost of treating workers as disposable equipment, the deadly consequences when systems designed to protect people are corrupted by those who value gold over blood.